Simply put, Danny Goldberg is a legend in rock. He has worked with so many artists, it's just amazing. Before he jump-started Kiss's career and signed Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots, in 1969 he started out as a journalist and attended the Woodstock concert and even did a review of the event. One of Danny's first interviews was with Van Morrison to discuss the Moondance album. He's worked with Led Zeppelin as a publicist and promoted the Houses of the Holy album. He was president of Atlantic Records, and he was vice president of Swan Song Records and signed Bad Company. He also launched Stevie Nicks' solo career in 1981, and that's just a small fraction of his accomplishments. So let's go talk to Danny and see how his career started. Hi, Danny. How are you doing today?
Not bad. How are you?
Pretty good. So, Danny, how did you start out in this amazing career you have?
I dropped out of college after a week. I'd gone to University of California, Berkeley, starting in the fall of '67, and it was, the Bay Area after the Summer of Love. I just got caught up in rock and roll and drugs, frankly, at that time. And then about, 9 months later, I'm back in New York and wanted to get a job so I could get my own place and move out of my parents' apartment. And there was an ad in the New York Times for a clerical job at Billboard. I didn't know what Billboard was. It said magazine, and I liked the idea of a magazine because I'd written for the high school newspaper. And I discovered quickly that the rock and roll music that I loved was part of this thing called the music business. It was a revelation to me that there was a whole industry around this thing that I liked. And the original job was to call record stores around the country to get the information about what was selling. There were no barcodes at that time. And then I saw there were people on the other side of the office who were not that much older than me. I mean, I was 18, but there were people that were maybe like 30 who got to go to concerts for free and got free records because they wrote their opinions about music. And I thought I could do that. So I started covering some shows for them that the other writers didn't want to cover. And one of those was the Woodstock Festival, because the older writers didn't want to be in the mud. They liked to go to venues like the Copacabana where they could get free drinks. So I was delighted to cover Woodstock, and that was really, that review still kind of shows up on the internet. So I started as a journalist, critic, wrote for different rock magazines of the time in the late 60s, early 70s. Didn't really make it as a critic. I wasn't that critical. I really was more of a fan. And that's who I was, but it wasn't the most useful attribute to get taken seriously journalistically. But it was the exact attribute that made me a very effective publicist, and that was the beginning of my career in the business. Was a publicity job at a PR firm called Salters and Roskin. It was a showbiz firm. They had a lot of Broadway shows and did Sinatra, Barbra Streisand, and the guy who ran it, Lee Salters, wanted like a young person who could get some of this rock and roll business, because the business was exploding then, and kind of taught me how to be a professional publicist. And just, within the first 4 or 5 months of being there, Led Zeppelin became a client. And he said, I was the only guy in the company who was right for Led Zeppelin. So that was an incredible opportunity, to do publicity for Zeppelin. And that's really where my career took off.
What year was that you started with the job?
That was 1973. I did the publicity in the United States. I mean, obviously they had a global following, but my role was just in the U.S. They did a tour in 1973 following the release of the album Houses of the Holy. Jimmy Page had been in the Yardbirds, had an identity because the Yardbirds, were a pretty respected band. The other guys in the band were not well known publicly. John Paul Jones, obviously very respected as an arranger of the Donovan records and other records, but wasn't this high profile a figure. And Bonham and Plant were really new to most of the public. But when the record came out in the US, it was a radio station in Boston, WBCN, in particular a disc jockey named J.J. Jackson, who played it the first time, and they kind of broke in Boston. Happened quite quickly. It was the time when these FM radio stations were really powerful connectors between the rock audience. So I assume they played the Boston Tea Party. That was like the equivalent in Boston of what the Fillmore East was in New York,
Right.
and so on. But that would have been, I think, 69. I didn't start working with them till 4 years later.
Gary Malaber, who I'm friends with, he was first band was Raven, and they opened up for Zeppelin at that show.
Cool. Did he know how great they were at the time, or he was preoccupied with his own?
He was blown away. He said, "They're changing something here. They're changing the direction of music right now." And John Bonham was very impressed by Gary's playing. So Gary and John got along. So that was awesome. Prior to that, though, you were working with Did you work with Van Morrison?
No, I interviewed Van Morrison.
Okay.
In my journalist days. I had met his manager at the time, a woman named Mary Martin, and she and I loved the album.
Astral Weeks?
No, it was the one after Astral Weeks.
Moondance?
Moondance, yeah. Moondance had come out. I had reviewed it for Record World, which was my second magazine I worked for, and so there was another magazine called Jazz and Pop that had been asking, the editor was asking if I wanted to do something, and she said okay to me interviewing Van Morrison. So I went up to his, he was living in Woodstock then, and Moondance had come out, and he was starting on some of the music for the next record. I was a huge fan. Even Brown Eyed Girl I had loved, first single, and then Astral Weeks I was, like many other people, a fan of, and Moondance to me took it to a whole new level, and so I was able to interview him. That would have been 1970, I think, and it was unbelievably exciting for me to meet him, and his first artist that I really loved that I got to meet in person, and but that was as a journalist. I never worked with him in a professional way.
I heard he's been a good person to talk to, so I guess your conversation went well.
I was happy with it a long time ago, obviously. I think it's somewhere, there's this website called Rock's Back Pages, which is like an archive of rock criticism. They have a bunch of, 20 or 30 of my pieces from the early 70s. I wasn't the greatest writer. I think I'm a better writer now, but I was enthusiastic, and it's fun that stuff is archived.
There was no category to put that album in, and it was a mixture of different flavors. It wasn't a jazz album. It wasn't a folk album. The record company couldn't figure out where to put that. What category?
Well, I don't know about that. I think it was his most successful album up until that point. It was much more successful than Astral Weeks was. Astral Weeks was like kind of a critical favorite. The Rolling Stone writers loved it, and it's become correctly a classic. But Moondance was much more successful. It got played on the rock radio stations, and the rock press wrote about it, and it was marketed as a rock album. Even though obviously rock at that time was blooming into a multi-genre thing. It grew after Sgt. Pepper's. Artists suddenly had you could be a rock artist and you could have horns, you could have strings, you could do things that were outside of just guitar, bass, and drums. So he was part of that general diversification of the definition of rock and roll, but he was also one of the greatest songwriters that the genre ever produced, and one of the greatest singers.
Into the Mystic is one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
So going back to Led Zeppelin, is there anything else you wanted to say about that? I know you were the manager of the Swan Song records.
I wasn't the manager. I mean, that's not a title that really exists with record companies in general. The Swan Song was created by Peter Grant, who was the band's manager. And it was a time when a number of other artists kind of had their own quote-unquote labels. The Beatles obviously started it with Apple Records, and then the Rolling Stones had Rolling Stones Records, and Jefferson Airplane had Grunt Records. And it was kind of a sign of superstar status, and it was a reflection of the fact that there were artists in England that the members of the band and that Peter could get, so they were like an A&R source. And so when that was started, after I had done publicity for the 73 tour, at the end of that year, Peter reached out to me through their lawyer, Steve Weiss, and offered me the job of being vice president of Swan Song in the United States, which was in essence, being their liaison in the U.S. to the booking agencies for the artists and to Atlantic Records, who provided the promotion and distribution of Swan Song, and to continue to oversee the publicity, which was the skill that I already had.
What are your fondest moments of working on Swan Song?
Oh, that's such a general question, but, generally speaking, the first Bad Company album was incredibly exciting to be involved with because it just exploded and became a #1 album within weeks of its release, and I got to bask in the glow of that. So that was an incredible thing. And then obviously that was 74. And then in 75, Zeppelin did another American tour, and anytime to be at his Led Zeppelin show and to be backstage and to be dealing with the press and the photo passes, and it's just an incredibly exciting time in my life, and the band was, I think, in very, very good form. So that's the closest I can come to answering that question.
So I have a question. So in 1973, you were at the Madison Square Garden when they were filming "Song Remains the Same."
My memory is that it was 3 nights at Madison Square Garden, but yes, I was at those shows where "The Song Remained the Same" was filmed. Absolutely, I was their publicist, and it was at all of those shows. Those were great shows. The show itself was the show that they were doing then, and it was, they were at their peak. I mean, Bonham was just incredibly important in those shows, and the chemistry between Jimmy and Robert,
Yeah.
especially on that song, Dazed and Confused, was really magic, and obviously Stairway to Heaven had come out the year before, and, pretty exciting when you hear the first few chords of that. They were an amazingly good band, as the films and recordings of those tours, demonstrate.
Was that the time that they were robbed? Somebody took their
Yes, that's when they were robbed. At the end of there was they were staying at the Drake Hotel in New York, and Zeppelin, Peter Grant, they would sometimes he liked to get paid in cash. There always seemed to be a lot of cash around. Part of it was to settle up with the crew, and part of it was I just think he liked cash. So they had, I think it was $280,000 in cash in a safety deposit box that was robbed, a crime which has never been solved. So there's some rumors that it may have been an inside job, but I don't know what happened. I just know it was a moment for me that was important because Peter Grant, who was a 300-pound former wrestler, intimidating, cocky, tough guy manager, had come to the conclusion by then that he could trust me more than he trusted anyone at the record company to handle the media. We did like this press conference. There were TV crews there, and that went well enough. I think that left Peter with a good taste in his mouth about me, and I think that was the context in which a few months later I was offered the job to work for them full time at the newly created Swan Song. So it was just sort of a surreal thing, and like I said, no one was ever arrested or even suspected of it. So there's different theories about what happened to that money, but it was front page of New York Daily News. Led Zepp robbed of $280K, and at that time the New York Daily News had the widest circulation of any newspaper in America. And my boss Lee Salters, who was an old school PR guy, who started doing it in the 1940s, was very excited that it said Led Zepp robbed instead of rock band robbed. To him, he felt it validated that we'd done a good job for them. So, through the lens of a PR guy, that was a good thing.
Wow. And then Jimmy Page I read that he was up for 3 days. He was so much excitement he didn't sleep at all. Is that true?
Well, I wouldn't know. I did sleep. So but that seems like an exaggeration to me, but there were certainly drugs around that could keep people up all night those days around big rock bands.
Right.